I wish it weren't the case, but parents are overwhelmed. And as a result, we're constantly looking for resources, for helps. We want to know how to do a better job as parents, and certainly among God's people because we understand the task that God has given us. And even though much of the work we do here at RenewCast is specifically focused on Christian education, because of the overlap, because of the partnership between the home and the school, it's important for us from time to time to look at resources, podcasts, workshops, books, all the different resources that are out there to continue to figure out how can we do a better job of making recommendations, how can we improve the relationship between the home and the school. And that's why in today's RenewRec episode, we're going to look at two books that are specific to parenting that can help us think more strategically and intentionally about the task that God has given us as Christian parents. Welcome once again to RenewCast, the podcast of Renew Education. I'm Noah Brink. In today's RenewRec episode, we're looking at two books that I've read in the past year, and both of them are fabulous in terms of giving practical, healthy, followable resources, recommendations to help us think more strategically about our roles as parents. And obviously, and I mentioned this in the intro, I read, and as much as I can, I try to get my hands on different books on Christian education, Christian parenting, the roles of parents, thinking strategically about parents from a Christian perspective, or understanding human developments, kind of how our kids grow and what it means to understand the developmental stages of kids. I listen to podcasts, I'm looking at websites, trying to figure out what are some good places for me as a dad to start, but also because of my work in Christian education, it's pretty normal for people to reach out and say, do you have any ideas of good books to look at? And I'm also asking people the same question because I want to know, how can I do a better job with my own children? How can I become a better father? Obviously, I think any parent is asking that very same question. So today I want to focus on two books. I've read both of these in the past year, and I don't know if I would say they're the best books I've read on parenting. They're up there, but they're two that I read this year, and they both have sort of a common thread in that the focus here is on the intentional work of a parent. Some books focus more specifically on understanding children. Some books focus on maybe some skills in terms of discipline or whatever else. These two books are more about the intentional nature of parenting because I think we all know this, that a lot of times decisions that are made as parents are more reactive. Life comes at us. We know, even though there are lots of books written for parents, we all kind of say, well, there's no really good manual for parenting. We just kind of find ourselves stumbling into it and trying to figure it out. By the way, as a parent now, I have three children, 14, 12, and 10, it's made me much more sympathetic to my parents because I realized they too were stumbling through life trying to figure out what it means to be a parent. And we kind of think of our own parents as people that somehow they just had it figured out or they never did. Lord willing, they did have it figured out. But then we find ourselves in that same place and we realize, wait a second, my parents didn't know what they're doing either. My wife, Katie, and I are often feeling like we're just kind of responding as things come our way. And I think that's kind of the norm. It's hard for me to say that's bad because that is what's pretty normal. The reality is, though, that unless we get in front of things, we find ourselves creating habits. And so I want to focus on this habits notion because the first book that I'm going to recommend is entitled Habits of the Household. It's written by Justin Whitmel Early. I came across it a couple years ago, began reading through it, and revisited it this year for a Sunday school class I had the joy of teaching at my church. And one of the beauties of Early's book, it's once again, the habits of the household. It falls in line with some of the episodes that we've had here on the show on recognizing the importance of habits, that habits are critical to the notion of formation. That we realize that if people want to change happens at the heart level. And heart level, if you're ever going to get at the heart, it's often affected through ritual and through habits. Habits allow practices to seep down into our subconscious. So I appreciate the notion of habits. And one of the things that Early says throughout the book is that whether we like it or not, our homes actually do have habits. Many of those habits that we have structured in our home aren't even habits that we intended to set about, but we just kind of found ourselves having those. For instance, one of the habits I became the one who primarily was doing bath night at or bath time at night with my children. And it started with trying to give my wife some space after a long day, and before I knew it, I was the one doing all the baths. And that just became sort of like our routine. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just sort of happened. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of us as parents. We have all these routines, and our kids are being shaped by those routines. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about Early's book is that he starts talking about habits first thing in the morning. And by the way, a big premise of his book is unless we are thinking about the habits in our own lives, we're not going to be able to do a very good job of working with our children to make sure that our homes have good habit lives, so that our children are being properly shaped and properly formed. Because so the book, once again, it's about formation. It's not just about ideas. It's not just about rules and ritual or rules and regulations. It's about formation, understanding that we want our children to become a sort of a person, for their hearts to be bent in a certain way. So as a father, and it gives very practical things, think about first thing in the morning. What are my habits? And by the way, I think that there's a lot of honest reflection in this book. What are my habits? What is the first thing I do in my day? Is it automatically becoming consumed with email and you start thinking about the idolatry of the pressures and the busyness of the world? Is my day grounded in dependence upon who God is and his greater reality? And so this idea of habits, recognizing our habits ground us so that our habits can also ground our kids and ground our home. So he does a very good job of thinking sort of about the habits from the moment we wake up in the morning until we go to bed at night. He has a chapter on meal times and conversations. By the way, the Barna Group has done a lot of research on conversations, and they say that your average parent has less than 7 minutes of meaningful conversation a day with their children. Think about that in your own home. Like, do we have habits where we're trying to nurture conversation, or does conversation just sort of happen? We need relationship. That's how we change. We don't change through rules and regulation or rules and rigidity and regulations. We change through habits, through relationship in those habits. And so much of Early's book is focused on how do we breathe more relationship, how do we breathe more healing and repair and restoration, how we think about mealtime, how we think about discipline, how we think about screen time, habits. And like I said, a lot of the times we have these habits and we don't even know that they're there, but our kids do. They become very much, and we have an earlier episode on belonging, and one of the things I talk about in milestones, we have an episode on milestones too, that there are sort of these habits and rituals that our kids need. Well, we create these habits unintentionally, and those habits, they are shaping our kids. Habits of the household, and every chapter has very practical, here's some ideas. Think about your marriage. He has a chapter on marriage, and it's right in the center of the book, because he basically says that the habits of your household are going to be pretty rotten if you're not figuring out how you strengthen your marriage. And so what would be some habits in your marriage so that you can strengthen that relationship so that it can trickle over into the habits of the household? So I really do appreciate thinking about meal times, about waking, about bedtime at night. What are those habits? About discipline and screen time. Really, really wonderful, practical, and it's seasoned, deeply seasoned with grace, because it recognizes you're going to blow it, I'm going to blow it. But one of the beauties of focusing on habits is if we can create these habits, those become our instincts. So when I think about discipline, if I create habits of discipline and how we go about discipline in the home, that when my emotions all of a sudden flare, if I've created habits, I default to the habit, because that's just become sort of ingrained into the way I think. I mean, think about what you do at the dinner at dinner. By the way, a lot of the data out there suggests that the single most formative thing you can do to help your children be healthy human beings is have meals together. So what are some of those goals that we want to have in our home, and how do we create habits to move towards that? And that's idea right there is core to Early's book, and it's also core to my other book that I want to recommend is The Intentional Father by Jon Tyson. Now, obviously, the book Intentional Father is geared towards fathers. That's why I picked it up. Do I think that a mother could benefit from it? Yes, I do. It still is very much kind of the relationship between a father and his son. I think that father and daughters, there's also going to be some benefit there. But one of the premises here, too, is that life just comes at you. We find ourselves stumbling into it, and rarely do parents, dads, mothers actually chart out a plan. And that's what I love about Jon Tyson's book. It's very intentional. Obviously, the book is entitled Intentional Father, at helping fathers, parents chart out a plan. As an example, he asked the question, what would be some of those things that you would want to make sure that your children know to do, or you could say maybe they are, before they leave home? Leaving home in many homes is when the kids go off to college, or maybe after they finish up college. But what would be some of those things that you want to make sure your children know how to do, or how to feel or think? What would be some experiences that you want to make sure your children know? What would you be embarrassed if your children go off to college not knowing how to do? For instance, I would like to make sure that my child knows how to give a firm handshake and to look someone in the eye and not just answer questions with one or two words, but in a thoughtful answer, and then has the politeness to be able to respond back and ask questions. Well, it would be nice for that just to happen, but most likely it's not just going to happen unless I think intentionally about, okay, that's going to be on my list. How am I going to build experiences to help to teach my son or my daughters how to do those things? And one of Tyson's big premises is that our kids are always being discipled by someone. They're being discipled by their culture. And am I willing as a father to think about apprenticeship? Because that's kind of, once again, this notion of discipleship. You look at John Mark Comer and the way he talks about discipleship. It's very much in line with the notion of apprenticeship. If I want my child, my son, my daughter, to become a person who loves God, and for that child to be a disciple, then I have to think in terms of apprenticeship and my responsibility. In the same way that a master and apprentice, you're showing people how to do things. And so this book is very much pressing into the idea that you need to create a plan. What are the values that you have for your children? What are the values you have for yourself? Write them down and begin to start thinking, how do I want to make sure that my children have those same values? You could say, I want to make sure that everyone knows that I value hard work. Well, do I ever ask my kids to work hard with me? If I value hard work, I can't just say, do it. I need to figure out experience, because we are whole persons, image bearers of God, head, heart, hand. So if I think about experiences, if I think about the heart and the ideas, so knowledge, but also learning how to put it into practice, because that's the way Jesus taught. Jesus taught in terms of wanting to make sure that people were grounded in truth, that they were transformed through relationship, but then solidified through experiences. So I appreciate Jon Tyson by basically saying, dads, moms, we need to do a better job of recognizing that discipling our own kids is hard work. And considering the amount of hours in the day they are with some other person or persons, teachers, youth group, whomever else, they are being discipled there. I need to work hard at this and take it seriously. And I know it does sound daunting. Either of these books, they sound daunting, and they're both written and they're seasoned with grace, recognizing this is not supposed to be burdensome. This should cause us to recognize that ultimately it is God who changes hearts, to be dependent upon Him, to recognize His provision. But they also sort of chart out a plan. Like, here is a plan for making tangible momentum toward having better habits in our home, more intentionality as a father. And I tend to think, whether you have children in your home or not, these are the sorts of things that Christian educators need to be thinking about. If you're a youth director, what would be some of those habits? What would be some of those intentional things? I want to make sure that those that I'm tasked with discipling, that we're going to go about trying to make sure that people know how to do. I think that we often just feel like if we just talk about some good things here and there, It just will sort of materialize, or hopefully that by the time my kids leave home, they will know how to do these things. And we just sort of hope that it's going to happen maybe by osmosis, rather than saying, okay, it's going to take some work. Maybe you even think, here are the list of some of the movies or books that I want my children to read or watch. These are important, and I want to have conversations with my kids. Make a list of those movies. Make a list of the songs, the bands. These are all those sorts of things that it could be a very life-giving sort of thing. Think about your habits of your home. If you want your children to love music, how are you going to create habits so that your children would love music? These things, they're not just going to happen considering that they are being discipled by someone else. The world is creating habits. The world is putting pressure. And I love, once again, where Flannery O'Connor says that we have to learn how to push harder against the culture than it pushes against us. That's part of what it looks like to live as God's people. And I think that both of these books, Habits of the Household by Justin Whitmel Early and The Intentional Father by Jon Tyson, at least in the past year or so, are two of the most practical books that I can recommend to give us sort of the resources to make tangible and practical, and you could say even chartable improvements in these areas. I encourage you to pick up a copy of both of them. And if you find some nuggets in there that you think are especially interesting, reach out to us here at the show. But I do hope that these books could be a blessing to you, and that you will find in them some real hope, and pass them on to your friends. Thanks so much for listening to our show. Until next time. Thanks so much for listening to our show. If you like what you heard, subscribe, leave us a comment, or share with a friend. To find out more about Renew Education, visit our website at www.renew-education.org. Watch us on our YouTube channel for various podcast episodes, YouTube shorts, and Worldview Brieflies. And you can listen to our show wherever podcast episodes are found.